This is Laborc, and it is so nice to have you here. These are the paints you need. Okay guys, it's time to buy the bullet. This is not speed painting, okay? So in the tutorial I will paint one of each troopers, except for this guy, because I left him out for no reason. But I would highly recommend that you do these troopers in one go. Once you finish the 7 of the same type, it will be easier and less mentally taxing. Okay, we start with removing the mod lines. This is a never-ending process in itself because there will always be new ones. Use the sharp part of your blade and cut off those mod lines to have a nice even surface. If you find some going around their hair and skull, just cut into the hair, because the hair with a little bit less detail is looking way better than a hair with a mod line. Then we prime all the troopers with Vallejo's Black Mecha Primer. If you don't have an airbrush, just use a can primer instead. If you paint your games, I would highly recommend getting an airbrush. I know everyone is on the fence about investing into an airbrush, and believe me, you don't need to buy an expensive airbrush at first or ever, but it's way cheaper to use an airbrush for priming, and not to mention the airbrush is the ultimate tool to speed up your painting process, period. These shield guard uniforms are pretty dark. I think they are meant to be a dark grey with a desaturated grey-greenish tint. I start with thunderhawk blue and create the highlights. My airbrush is at 5 psi and the paint consistency is 1 part paint, 1.5 part water. It's very thin, but this is the consistency you need so you can longer work with the airbrush without clogging it. If your airbrush tip gets a little bit dry, just remove the paint with your hands and you are good to go. Since the suits are quite dark, we only covered 60% of the surface, and I'm trying to make the transition from black to the thunderhawk blue as smooth as Granny's butt cheek. Try to aim your airbrush in a zenithal way, like light is coming from above. I'm only covering the dark parts as much so they lose their satin shine and the whole miniature will have a matte finish. Reduce the highlight areas with blue-gray and use thin layers. Add a little bit of water to your wet palette and make sure your paint has a 60% opacity. This way you can create seamless blends on the airbrush surface. If your paint is too thick, then the new layer will stand out and I will slap on your tiny hand. Make sure you create these brighter highlights on the shoulders and chest. Try to catch some folds on the suit too and be consistent with your highlight placement. Carefully examine the angle of your shapes. For example, if one of the trooper's legs is leaning forward, then we can highlight the thighs, but if the angle is negative, then we should keep them dark. Remember, these suits are dark, so we don't need to highlight everything, okay? Okay, take your time, make sure your highlights make sense and are consistent. A well-placed, roughly painted highlight is still better than a perfectly blended highlight at the wrong place. Now it's time for blending. I would highly recommend that you do the blending with the airbrush, using a thinner consistency, but I show you how to do it with a brush. Thin your paint to a glaze consistency and move your brush from the darker to the brighter layer, depending on which color you are using. We are blending the thunderhawk blue, so we move the paint from the brighter to the darker layer. My paint consistency is around 1 part paint, 1 part water. With that, we not only blend the colors, but make our highlights a little bit smaller so the suit will become darker. The color ratios of your layer are going to determine your midtone. The midtone has to be in the largest ratio when you'd like a certain color to read as your midtone when painting something. At this part, I'm also making sure that I'm happy with all the highlight placements. It's a bit harder this way because all the models are different, that's why I said it's better to do the same ones in one batch first. So you can check if you missed the highlight or not. And you can compare the models. And not only that, but it's easier for a brain to do the same ones in one go without splitting the stack, because when you paint the same 7 suit or face, you are going to paint those 7 things for the first time. And if you do it in one sitting, the very best thing about it, that there won't be a next time, because the next batch is going to be a little bit different. But make no mistake, painting these dark gray suits is going to be boring, no matter what. So if you're grabbing a speed paint and paint all these miniatures in a fraction of time with a little bit less good looking result, that's completely up to you. But if you go into this project with my approach, I can guarantee that you are going to be so much faster with blending, which is the most time consuming part when it comes to miniature painting. Not to mention, this could be done with an airbrush, which I cannot stress how much faster it is once you get the hang of it. Alright, let's do the accessories on the suit with those nice white leather straps. Now if you watched some of Papa Laborc's videos, you know that the secret to painting white is that we don't use pure white at all. In the real world, very few things are actually white, and very few things are actually black. Most of the time, both colors are more of versions of grey, which is funny because neither black or white are technically colors. Cover everything with London grey or any dark neutral grey of your choice. Some brushstrokes needs to be more confident on the boots to emphasize the shape of the folds. Just make sure you narrow them from the light source. So basically, you are painting a little pointy triangles as highlights. Don't worry if it's not blending on its own, we can always glaze over these layers or use the airbrush to blend them. I would only use the airbrush on the boots and gloves and a little bit on the backpacks, on the runners, because we don't want the straps around the shoulders and legs to have some overspraying on our finished suit from the airbrush. Now I'm going to use blue gray to reduce the highlight areas on the straps. Probably this is the slowest part, but don't worry, Papa Laborc will get you through it. Just put on a podcast while you are painting or watch The Office for the 6th time while you are doing these leather straps. By the way, I was thinking that what's the point of the harness around their chest? Because it looks like a harness for a holster, but the holster for the guns are on the leg. So it doesn't make much sense other than making our life a little bit harder because we can't blend those parts with an airbrush. Anyway, if you have some masking putty, you can totally blend these parts with an airbrush. And in retrospect, putting on the putty and blending with the airbrush, it would have been faster, I think. Give it a go and let me know in the comments if you are going to try that. And one little trick you can do for these straps, once you sketched your layer, edge highlight the darker parts with the current highlight color. This always adds some extra detail to it. The final highlight is Gauss Blaster Green, a very pale minty color. Cover at least 50% of the straps and pouches with this layer, so they will look white next to the dark suits. They are not white, but it's going to feel white because we need to calculate with the effect of the relative contrast. Contrast means difference, and in our case is the difference between the values. The bigger the difference, the higher the contrast will be. The higher the contrast, the more eye-catching a mini can be. It doesn't mean you need to paint everything to a high contrast, but some things are worth having a little bit of extra work. That's how I use my airbrush for blending. Thin paint consistency and very gentle trigger control, so you can barely see when I start to spray first, right? Try to find the dead zone of your airbrush trigger. The more diluted your paint, the less dead zone you will have. It takes a bit of practice, but it's really worth it. Now we are going to paint the faces. I don't want to go very deeply into the details of painting faces because that could be a whole video in itself. I just like to provide some colors for the different skin tones. For a dark skin variant, I start with catachan flesh and leave 30% of the face black. I will glaze over this black with a more diluted consistency to smooth out the transition. Then I add some parasite brown to the catachan flesh and emphasize the forehead, chin, cheeks, nose and upper part of the mouth. After this step, I paint the eyes using silver grey for the white part and black for the iris. Always give a direction to the eyes because it's easier to paint it that way. On the hair, I went back with catachan flash and painted 30% of the surface, so the hair stays nice and dark that way. Then I go in with parasite brown and reduce the highlight areas. For the guys, you can have a more rigid face, separated with some laughing wrinkles around the mouth and a bigger contrast around the eyebrows and the cheeks. On the female face, you need smoother transitions, otherwise it will look like a dude. For the last highlight, I mix some morghast bone to the parasite brown and reduce the highlight areas. I used thin layers, so it was very easy to blend in these colors, but make sure you always wait for the layers to dry before applying a new one. The hair will receive the same color as the face, but try to add some dots to the catachan flash layer so you can create some texture on the hair. For the white skin tone, I use night questor flash. I build up the opacity with thin layers and following the same principles with the previous faces. I use cadian fleshtone for the highlights and I use thin layers. I take my time with the blending, especially on the woman's face, to make them more feminine. On the guy, you can leave some hardy chisel chin and cheekbones. Add some elven flesh to the cadian flesh for the final highlights. For the brown hair, I'm using burnt red and I cover 60% of the surface and blend it in with some thin layers. Mix some cadian flesh to the burnt red and highlight the top part of the hair. Treat it as a continuous surface and don't pick out the hairs one by one. Then use cadian flesh for the shiny parts, picking out some locks on the front. Let's see a variation for blonde hair too. Cover everything with catachan flesh. Then cover 60% of the surface with parasite brown. Reduce the highlight areas towards the face with zamesi desert. Add some crispy shiny hair locks with pale sand on the front. Okay, let's paint those S.H.I.E.L.D symbols with a mix of parasite brown and zamesi desert. The small symbols on their shoulders are very small and quite poorly detailed, so I'm just covering those in one go, because I can't really figure out them, unfortunately. After that, highlight the top part of the symbols with zamesi desert. Now for the shock buttons, this is going to be super easy. Just lightly dry brush the top part of them with Ghost Blaster Green. It's a quick and nice effect. Anyway, I'm not sure if the shock buttons are the best weapons against undead superheroes, but maybe they are. If you are not familiar with dry brushing, just dip your brush into a paint pot, remove the excess on a paper towel and gently apply it on the model, mostly from one direction. Okay, as you can see, the base is already painted. If you want to see how I achieved this base with a few simple steps, you can access that part of the tutorial on my Patreon page for only €2 a month. The link is in the video description. Let's finish the runners with their goggles and extra armor. I'm using the same grays as before, sketch the highlights with London grey and use blue-grey for the edges. And for the goggles, I use Ghost Blaster Green to create a shiny glint effect and edge highlight along the frame of the goggles. Lastly, I paint the rim of the base with black. There you go guys, some of the S.H.I.E.L.D troopers ready to catch the undead heroes of the game. I hope you like this tutorial and it will help you finish the core box. So thank you for joining me on this little painting adventure. A huge thanks to my patrons who support this kind of videos. With special shout out to Jonathan Rhodes, Cold-Blooded Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, Rulzak, Vlad D, One Sharp Joe Crafts, Glitchy Macrash, Guillaume Belanger. If you want to support the work of Papa Laborc, you can do that on Patreon, where you will have early access to these videos with some exclusive content, or if you need a little bit of extra help, online coaching is also available. Now, I hope the rest of your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt.